Hello, this is Bruce Wan, Head of Research for MaxCap Group. In this video, I want to talk about some of the fascinating shifts in housing demand we have seen over the past few years. With the pandemic and the lockdowns, we've seen a concerted push to quit the rat race, bail from the city, to seek out the socially distant, quiet life on the beach or in the bush. The key question is, what's happened since then? And more importantly, what does it mean for the Australian housing market? Casting our minds back to the beginning of the pandemic, there were massive flows of people in 2020 as border closures came in for both international and interstate travellers. At that time, the lockdowns were far more restrictive in some cities compared to others. Indeed, the cities with the harshest lockdowns were where we saw the largest outflows of people starting in 2020, but mostly occurring in 2021. These outflows were most obvious in Melbourne and Sydney. Specifically, Melbourne saw its population fall by 6% in the inner ring in 2021 and by a massive 13% in the CBD, while Sydney saw its population drop by 3% in the inner suburbs over that same year. The really interesting question is, where did the people go given the choice between outer suburbia, tree change in the bush, or sea change by the beach? The answer really depended on the city, with the seaside option being far more popular in Sydney and Melbourne, and the suburban option being much more common in Brisbane and Perth. All of this is ancient history, of course, as we do our very best to scrub the pandemic from our memory banks. The more relevant question for us today is, did these people come back after the pandemic? Since then, we've seen resurgent population growth, not just in Sydney and Melbourne, but across all state capitals in 2023. Some of that related to people returning to the city as offices physically reopened for work. Some of that related to the fresh inflow of overseas migrants into these cities after international barriers came down. In other words, we didn't actually see the reverse flight of people leaving the bush or the beach and returning to the city. What we have seen, however, is a strong rebound in the major city, mostly because more overseas migrants landed on shore. All of these demographic shifts have very direct and consequential impacts on the housing markets across Australia. Looking at this chart, we can see the recent trends in residential rental inflation sorted by their proximity to the nearest capital city. Clearly, the most dramatic adjustment was the sharp fall in rents for the inner city during the lockdown. That rental correction ended in 2021 as borders reopened and travel resumed. Since then, the surge in rents have been much stronger in the inner city in 2023 and 2024 as international and intrastate arrivals all competed for the same scarce rental stock. Notably, we have not seen a corresponding rental correction in the more remote locations. While rental growth has slowed outside of the city, they are still rising at a relatively firm pace compared to where they were before the pandemic. Altogether, we have seen a remarkable shift in housing demand over the past few years, triggered by a flight from the city initially, before a switch back partially towards the city. The recent market has been more dominated by the massive inflows of overseas migrants, which is lifting housing demand and pricing across all the major capital cities. If you want to find out more about this fascinating topic and the related market opportunities, come and talk to our capital team for more details. This has been Bruce Wan from MaxCap Group.